Some creatures don't choose the people they protect. They choose the people the world has forgotten. The first scream echoed across Frost Hollow just as the church bell struck 7 on a gray October morning. Store owners abandoned their front porches. Mothers hurried children indoors, and every conversation dissolved into frightened whispers as a massive black wolf emerged from the pine forest bordering the town. It was unlike any wolf anyone had ever seen. Standing nearly as tall as a full-grown horse at the shoulder, its midnight coat shimmered beneath the pale sunlight, while its silver eyes calmly surveyed the streets with impossible intelligence. No one dared move. No one except Emily Carter. She stepped out of the small bakery carrying a paper bag filled with day-old bread she planned to deliver to Mrs. Dalton, the elderly widow who lived 3 blocks away. The moment she noticed the frozen crowd staring behind her, she slowly turned. There it stood less than 20 feet away, enormous enough to cast a shadow across the wooden sidewalk. Gasps rippled through the street as everyone waited for the beast to lunge. Instead, the giant wolf simply blinked once, lowered its head ever so slightly, and quietly walked past every terrified resident until it stopped directly behind Emily. Then, to everyone's astonishment, it sat. Calm, silent, patient. Emily let out the smallest sigh. "You again," she whispered under her breath. The wolf's ears twitched as if it had understood every word. This had not started today. It had started nearly 3 weeks ago when Emily first noticed enormous paw prints outside her tiny cottage at the edge of town. Every morning they appeared circling her home before disappearing back into the woods. Then came the distant glimpses between the trees whenever she gathered herbs. Then the quiet feeling of being watched during evening walks. Eventually she stopped wondering whether something followed her, because she already knew. It always stayed just far enough away to avoid frightening her. At least, that was true until this morning. Sheriff Collins slowly removed his hat, never taking his eyes off the animal. "Emily," he called carefully, "walk toward us. Nice and slow." She considered it for a second before shaking her head. He's not trying to hurt anyone. Several townspeople stared at her as though she had completely lost her mind. "It's a wild animal," someone shouted. "Look at the size of it." Emily glanced back over her shoulder. The wolf remained perfectly still, breathing quietly, its thick black fur rising and falling with each slow breath. There was something strangely peaceful about its expression. It wasn't hungry. It wasn't angry. If anything, it looked patient, as though waiting for her decision. Emily had spent most of her 24 years feeling invisible. She was the quiet Omega who volunteered at church dinners, delivered groceries to elderly neighbors, and always seemed to be helping someone else before helping herself. People appreciated her kindness, but rarely noticed her until something unusual happened. Now every eye in Frost Hollow followed her every movement. "Go home," she softly told the wolf. The giant ears flicked once. Nothing happened. She pointed toward the forest. "Seriously, go." Again, nothing. A little boy peered from behind his father's truck. "Mom," he whispered loudly enough for half the street to hear. "I think it likes her." His mother quickly pulled him back inside without answering. Emily couldn't help smiling despite herself. "You're making my life very difficult," she muttered. The wolf responded by slowly lying down at her feet like an oversized loyal dog, resting its enormous head across its front paws. A nervous laugh escaped someone across the street, followed immediately by confused silence. No one had expected the terrifying creature to behave so gently. Sheriff Collins cautiously approached within 30 feet before stopping again. "Emily, has it always been like this?" She hesitated. If she admitted the truth, people would ask questions she couldn't answer. Why her? Why now? Why did the creature appear wherever she went? She simply nodded once. "It follows me." A stunned silence settled over the street. By noon, everyone in Frost Hollow had heard the story. Some insisted Emily had somehow tamed the beast. Others believed she had been cursed. Children whispered excitedly about the mysterious wolf girl, while older residents quietly locked their doors before sunset. Emily ignored every rumor as she finally continued toward Mrs. Dalton's house, paper bag tucked beneath one arm. She never looked back because she already knew what she would see. Slow, steady, silent footsteps followed a few yards behind her all the way down Maple Street. And no matter how many times she glanced over her shoulder, the giant black wolf was always there, watching not the town, not the frightened people, but only her, as though the entire world had narrowed to a single quiet promise no one else could yet understand. By the next morning, Frost Hollow had stopped talking about the weather, the harvest, and the upcoming church fundraiser because every conversation somehow found its way back to Emily Carter and the impossible creature that refused to leave her side. Curtains shifted whenever she walked past a window. Porch swings creaked as neighbors leaned forward for a better look. Even the mail carrier slowed his truck whenever he spotted her on the sidewalk. Emily pretended not to notice the curious stares, but she could feel them following every step she took through town. What she could not ignore were the slow, familiar footsteps several yards behind her. The giant black wolf never hurried. It never growled. It never crossed the invisible distance it seemed determined to respect. It simply followed. When Emily stopped outside the general store, the wolf stopped. When she crossed Maple Street, it crossed only after every passing pickup truck had rolled safely by. When she entered the small public library to return 2 borrowed gardening books, the wolf quietly settled beneath the large oak tree across the street and waited without making a sound. People noticed everything. Mrs. Henderson whispered to the librarian that the beast must have been enchanted. Mr. Wilkins insisted someone from the state wildlife department should come immediately. Teenagers gathered on bicycles at the corner just to see whether the stories were true. They expected a monster. Instead, they found an enormous animal sitting with remarkable patience beneath the afternoon sun, occasionally lifting its silver eyes only when Emily emerged from another building. By the end of the week, children had invented a nickname that spread through town faster than any rumor before it. The Wolf Girl. Emily overheard it twice before lunch. A little girl tugged on her father's sleeve outside the diner. "Daddy, that is her." The father quickly lowered his voice. "Do not point." Emily smiled politely anyway, although the words lingered in her thoughts long after she walked away. She had spent years trying not to stand out. Now she had become the most talked-about person in Frost Hollow without saying more than a handful of sentences each day. What puzzled her even more was the wolf itself. It never accepted food from anyone else. Several brave residents had tossed pieces of steak toward it from a safe distance, but the animal merely sniffed the offerings before walking away. Yet when Emily purchased a fresh loaf of bread and sat on a wooden bench beside Miller Creek, the wolf slowly approached for the first time that afternoon. She broke off a small piece and smiled apologetically. "You are probably not interested in bread." To her surprise, the wolf gently accepted it from her open palm before sitting beside the bench. Emily laughed softly. "Well, I guess I was wrong." The wolf tilted its massive head ever so slightly, almost as if amused by her reaction. She studied its face more carefully than ever before. There were faint scars hidden beneath the thick black fur near one shoulder, old enough that the hair had grown back unevenly. Its ears carried tiny nicks that spoke of many winters survived. But its eyes remained the greatest mystery. They were not wild eyes. They carried an unmistakable awareness that unsettled her more than its enormous size ever could. Sometimes she caught herself wondering whether the wolf understood every word spoken around it. Sometimes she wondered whether it was watching the town instead of her. Those thoughts faded each time she remembered the way it always positioned itself. If strangers approached too quickly, the wolf calmly stepped between them and Emily without showing its teeth or making a threatening sound. If she walked home after sunset, it remained several yards behind until she safely reached her front porch before disappearing into the trees. It never entered her yard without permission. It never scratched at her door. It simply watched over the quiet cottage from the edge of the forest until dawn. Sheriff Collins noticed the same pattern after several days of careful observation. One evening he approached Emily outside the bakery just as she finished sweeping the front steps. "Has it damaged anything?" he asked. Emily shook her head. "No." "Has it frightened you?" She looked toward the distant tree line, where 2 silver eyes briefly reflected the fading sunlight before vanishing behind the pines. "Honestly," she admitted, "it frightens everyone else much more than it frightens me." The sheriff sighed deeply. "That is exactly what worries me." Emily understood his concern, but something inside her resisted believing the wolf meant harm. Kindness often revealed itself in quiet habits rather than dramatic gestures, and every strange habit this creature displayed seemed centered on protecting rather than threatening. Still, she had no explanation for the impossible bond growing between them. She did not know why the wolf had chosen her out of everyone in Frost Hollow. She did not know why it seemed content to spend entire days waiting for someone the town barely noticed until now. She only knew that every morning when she opened her front door, enormous paw prints already circled the cottage, fresh in the morning dew, proving that throughout every long night, while the town slept peacefully behind locked doors, someone had been standing guard just beyond the trees. 3 nights later, an early autumn rain settled over Frost Hollow, leaving the narrow roads shimmering beneath the glow of old street lamps and filling the air with the clean scent of pine and wet earth. Emily Carter finished organizing the last basket of bread at the bakery before wrapping a warm sweater around her shoulders and beginning the familiar walk home. Most evenings, she welcomed the peaceful silence after work, but lately that silence carried an unmistakable rhythm. Several seconds after her own footsteps came another set, heavier but never hurried, always keeping the same respectful distance. She did not need to turn around anymore. She already knew the giant black wolf was there. As she reached the edge of town where the paved sidewalk gave way to a gravel path leading toward her little cottage, she noticed something different. The footsteps stopped. Emily slowed until she came to a complete halt. The woods were unusually still. Even the wind seemed to pause among the towering pines. She looked back. The wolf remained partially hidden beneath the trees, standing perfectly motionless. For the first time since it had entered her life, it did not follow. A strange feeling settled in her chest. "Are you coming?" she asked softly. The wolf did not move. Instead, it lowered its head slightly, almost as though it were trying to hide something. Emily hesitated before carefully walking back toward the forest. The closer she came, the more she noticed subtle details hidden beneath the darkness. The animal was shifting its weight away from one front leg. Its breathing remained calm, but there was unmistakable stiffness in the way it stood. "You are hurt," she whispered. The silver eyes met hers, steady and unreadable. The wolf neither approached nor retreated. It simply waited. Emily glanced toward the empty road behind her. There was no one nearby. Every sensible warning she had ever heard about wild animals echoed through her thoughts, yet none of them seemed to match the creature standing before her. During the past several weeks it had never threatened anyone. It had never crossed a boundary she had not allowed. Taking a slow breath, she crouched several feet away. "I am not going to force you," she said gently. "But if you need help, you have to let me see." Rain gathered along the dark fur before sliding silently to the ground. Another long moment passed before the wolf took one careful step forward. Then another. Emily remained perfectly still. Finally, the enormous animal stopped close enough that she could clearly see its injured paw resting lightly against the damp leaves. It was not a severe injury, but a long scrape had collected bits of mud and small twigs. Emily slowly reached into the canvas bag she always carried. Inside were simple supplies she often used while gathering herbs: clean cloth, bottled water, and a small tin of homemade healing salve prepared from lavender, calendula, and beeswax. She held out the cloth first so the wolf could smell it. The great black nose twitched once before the animal relaxed its shoulders ever so slightly. "Thank you," she whispered, more surprised than frightened. With movements so slow they almost disappeared into the quiet evening, Emily gently poured a little water across the scrape, carefully washing away the dirt. The wolf never flinched. It watched her with remarkable patience, its silver eyes reflecting the faint moonlight breaking through the clouds above. As she finished cleaning the paw, Emily spread a thin layer of salve across the irritated skin. "There," she said with a warm smile. "It should feel better in a day or two." She expected the wolf to leave immediately. Instead, it lowered itself onto the forest floor only a few feet away. The enormous head tilted toward her as though studying every expression on her face. Emily laughed quietly. "You really do understand more than you should, do not you?" The wolf blinked once. She could not explain why, but something about those eyes stirred an unfamiliar feeling deep inside her memory, almost as if she had seen them somewhere years ago. Not the face, not the wolf, only the eyes. Calm, watchful, gentle beneath incredible strength. Before she realized what she was doing, Emily slowly lifted one hand. "May I?" The wolf remained completely still. Her fingertips finally brushed the thick black fur behind one ear. It was softer than she had imagined, warm despite the cool rain, and unbelievably dense beneath her hand. A quiet breath escaped the giant animal as it closed its eyes for only a brief moment, not in exhaustion, but in complete trust. Emily smiled without realizing it. I guess we are friends now. When she finally stood to continue home, the wolf rose with her. This time, instead of following several yards behind, it walked beside her for nearly 50 feet before gradually drifting back into its familiar place a respectful distance away. Hidden high above in the dark branches of an old pine tree, a gray owl watched the unusual pair disappear down the winding path. Frost Hollow still believed a mysterious beast was haunting the town, but the truth had already begun to change. Emily no longer saw a monster waiting in the shadows. She saw a silent guardian carrying old scars, impossible patience, and a loneliness that somehow mirrored her own. The quiet routine that Emily Carter had slowly accepted lasted exactly 4 more days before something changed the atmosphere of Frost Hollow once again. It began with 3 black luxury SUVs rolling through Main Street just after sunrise, their polished exteriors looking strangely out of place among weathered storefronts and old pickup trucks. Every conversation stopped as people watched the unfamiliar vehicles pass the bakery, the church, and finally disappear toward the historic town hall. By lunchtime, speculation had spread faster than fresh bread. Some claimed a wealthy investor wanted to buy the surrounding forest. Others insisted the governor was making an unexpected visit. Emily listened to every rumor while arranging loaves behind the bakery counter, but none of them explained why Sheriff Collins looked more serious than she had ever seen him. Late that afternoon, she carried another basket of unsold bread toward Mrs. Dalton's cottage. As always, she could hear the familiar measured footsteps following several yards behind. The giant black wolf remained calm despite the unusual activity filling the town. Children no longer screamed when they caught sight of it. Instead, they watched from porches with cautious curiosity while their parents remained uncertain whether to be afraid or simply confused. Emily smiled faintly to herself. The town was slowly growing accustomed to the impossible. She had almost reached the small park near Miller Creek when Sheriff Collins called her name. "Emily, wait a moment." She turned to find him standing beside his patrol truck, removing his hat with a tired expression. "Is everything all right?" she asked. He glanced toward the tree line where the black wolf had quietly stopped, observing from a respectful distance. "I wish I knew," he admitted. "The visitors who arrived this morning are not investors." Emily frowned. "Then who are they?" The sheriff lowered his voice. "They represent someone people have only whispered about for years." Before Emily could ask another question, the church bell rang 3 slow notes across the valley. Sheriff Collins looked toward the sound before speaking again. "The Alpha King." Emily blinked. The words sounded more like an old fairy tale than something connected to her ordinary life. Growing up in Frost Hollow, she had heard countless stories passed from one generation to another. They spoke of hidden pacts, ancient agreements, and a ruler who rarely appeared in public but somehow kept peace among communities scattered throughout the northern forests. Most people dismissed those stories as legends meant to entertain children around campfires. Sheriff Collins did not look like a man telling legends. "You believe he is real?" Emily asked quietly. "I know he is real," he answered without hesitation. "And according to those representatives, he is coming here." A cool breeze drifted through the pine trees. Emily instinctively looked toward the giant wolf. It remained perfectly still, its silver eyes fixed not on the sheriff but on the distant road leading into town. For the first time since she had met the mysterious creature, she sensed an alertness beneath its usual calm, as though it had heard something long before anyone else. Why would someone like that visit Frost Hollow? She wondered aloud. Sheriff Collins sighed. The representatives did not explain much, only that something important requires his personal attention. Emily laughed softly, trying to ease the growing tension. "Well, it certainly cannot have anything to do with me." The sheriff did not answer immediately. Instead, his eyes shifted toward the enormous wolf standing beneath the pines. "I hope you are right," he finally said. That evening, every diner booth, front porch, and grocery aisle buzzed with fresh theories. Some residents imagined a grand ceremony. Others feared strict new rules. The older townspeople remembered stories told by grandparents about a leader whose presence alone could silence an entire gathering without raising his voice. Emily listened politely, but found herself strangely distracted. Every few minutes, she glanced outside the bakery window. The wolf remained exactly where it always waited, watching the street with unwavering patience. Yet something about its posture had changed. It no longer looked merely protective. It looked watchful, almost as if anticipating someone's arrival. After closing the bakery, Emily began the familiar walk home beneath a sky painted with streaks of orange and deep blue. Halfway along the gravel path, she stopped beside the old wooden bridge crossing Miller Creek. The wolf quietly approached until it stood only a few feet away. "Everyone keeps talking about this Alpha King," she said with a gentle smile. "If the stories are true, they make him sound much scarier than you." The wolf's ears lifted slightly. Emily laughed. "Do not worry. I still think you are the kinder one." For the briefest moment, something remarkable happened. The giant wolf looked away, almost like someone hiding an unexpected reaction. Its tail gave the smallest movement before becoming still again. Emily could not explain why the tiny gesture made her smile even wider. She reached out and gently rested her hand against the thick black fur along its shoulder. "Whatever happens when those visitors return," she whispered, "I hope it does not change this." The wolf lowered its head ever so slightly beneath her touch, but its silver eyes remained fixed beyond the darkening trees, watching the distant highway where unseen headlights would soon carry someone whose arrival was destined to change both their lives forever. The Alpha King's arrival was announced not by sirens or ceremonies, but by silence. Before sunrise the next morning, Main Street seemed to hold its breath. The black SUVs returned, this time joined by several other vehicles that parked neatly outside the old town hall. Men and women dressed in dark tailored coats stepped out first, speaking quietly into small radios while respectfully surveying the square. No one raised their voice. No one appeared hurried. Yet somehow every movement carried quiet authority that caused even the most curious residents to remain behind sidewalks and storefront windows. Emily Carter finished placing fresh cinnamon rolls in the bakery display before glancing outside. She had never seen Frost Hollow so still. Even Sheriff Collins stood straighter than usual. "Do you think he is really coming?" her co-worker Hannah whispered. Emily shrugged gently. "I suppose we will find out soon." Less than 10 minutes later, another vehicle rolled slowly into the square. It was not flashy or oversized. In fact, it looked surprisingly ordinary compared to the others. The passenger door opened first, followed by the rear door. A tall man stepped onto the pavement with measured confidence. He wore a charcoal overcoat over a simple black suit, polished boots, and dark leather gloves despite the mild autumn weather. His hair was as dark as the midnight forest surrounding Frost Hollow, and his calm gray eyes swept across the square with effortless awareness. He did not appear angry. He did not need to. There was something about the quiet certainty in the way he stood that made the entire town instinctively lower its voices. Emily had expected someone older, perhaps someone who looked more like the legends people repeated around fireplaces. Instead, she found herself looking at a man who seemed impossibly composed, as though nothing in the world ever surprised him. Sheriff Collins approached first. The stranger offered a polite nod before listening carefully as the sheriff spoke. There were no dramatic gestures, no loud introductions. Yet everyone somehow understood exactly who had arrived. The Alpha King. Emily watched only briefly before returning to work. She had no reason to involve herself in visitors whose lives belonged to a completely different world. Or at least that was what she told herself. Shortly before noon, she carried another basket of bread toward the church pantry, where volunteers prepared meals for several elderly residents. The square remained crowded with curious neighbors hoping to catch another glimpse of the mysterious leader. Emily kept her eyes on the sidewalk until she suddenly sensed someone standing directly ahead. She looked up. The Alpha King stood only a few feet away. His expression remained calm, but his attention rested entirely on her. "Miss Carter," he said in a deep, controlled voice. Emily blinked. "You know my name? I make it a habit to know the people in every town I visit." His answer sounded polite enough, yet there was something unreadable beneath it. Before Emily could respond, a familiar feeling swept over her. Heavy footsteps. She turned instinctively toward the edge of the square. The giant black wolf had emerged from between two maple trees. Several people immediately stepped backward, but the wolf ignored everyone except Emily. It walked steadily toward her before stopping halfway between her and the Alpha King. The square became completely silent. Emily looked from the wolf to the Alpha King, unsure what to do. To her surprise, the Alpha King simply folded his hands behind his back and regarded the enormous animal with remarkable composure. "Interesting," he said quietly. The wolf did not growl. It merely stood there, calm and watchful, its silver eyes never leaving the man in front of it. Emily frowned. "He has never behaved like this before. Perhaps he believes he is protecting you," the Alpha King replied. "From you?" she asked before realizing how bold the question sounded. For the first time, something almost resembling amusement flickered across his otherwise composed expression. "That depends on whether he thinks I deserve his trust." Emily glanced back at the wolf. "I keep telling everyone he is gentle." "And what do you think of me?" the Alpha King asked unexpectedly. Emily hesitated just long enough to answer honestly. "People keep saying you are dangerous. Do you believe them?" She studied him for another moment. His posture remained perfectly controlled, yet there was an undeniable distance surrounding him, like someone accustomed to carrying responsibilities no one else could see. She finally smiled politely. "I think he still seems friendlier." For the briefest instant, the Alpha King's perfectly calm expression tightened almost imperceptibly before relaxing again. "Is that so?" he asked. Emily nodded without noticing the subtle reaction. Beside her, the giant wolf quietly sat on the pavement, as though completely satisfied with her answer. Several townspeople exchanged puzzled looks. Somehow the enormous wolf appeared entirely content, while the legendary Alpha King suddenly seemed just a little less pleased than before. Emily could not explain why the strange exchange lingered in her thoughts long after she continued toward the church, nor could she understand why. When she glanced back one final time, the Alpha King was no longer watching the wolf at all. He was watching her, with the same calm, unreadable intensity she had already come to recognize in another pair of silver eyes. The encounter in the town square refused to leave Emily Carter's thoughts. She replayed every word while measuring flour at the bakery the following morning, every glance while arranging fresh pastries, and every strange coincidence while walking home beneath the golden leaves of late October. The giant black wolf remained faithful to its familiar routine, appearing shortly after sunrise outside her cottage, waiting quietly while she locked the front door, then following at the same respectful distance all the way into town. Yet something else had changed. She had begun noticing another pattern she could no longer dismiss as chance. Every time the wolf disappeared into the forest, the Alpha King seemed to appear not long afterward. It happened once outside the church, again near Miller Creek, and once more that afternoon when Emily finished delivering bread to Mrs. Dalton. The wolf had quietly slipped between the trees only moments before a black SUV rolled slowly along the road. The Alpha King stepped out alone, thanked the elderly widow for allowing his representatives to inspect several old county maps, then walked back toward town without seeming surprised to find Emily nearby. "Miss Carter," he greeted politely. "Good afternoon." "Good afternoon," she answered. She glanced toward the woods almost instinctively. No silver eyes watched from the shadows. "Walking alone today?" he asked. "For the moment," Emily replied with a small smile. "I suppose my unusual companion decided I was safe enough without him." Something almost playful appeared in the Alpha King's expression before disappearing again. "Perhaps he simply trusts your judgment." Emily tilted her head thoughtfully. "That would be surprising. He usually decides everything for himself." The Alpha King gave the slightest nod. "Some protectors are stubborn." Emily laughed softly. "You sound as though you know him." "Perhaps I understand him better than most." His answer lingered in her mind long after they parted ways. That evening, while preparing tea inside her cottage, Emily found herself staring at the little tin of herbal salve she had used to treat the wolf's injured paw only days earlier. An unexpected memory surfaced. The following afternoon, when she had briefly crossed paths with the Alpha King outside Town Hall, she had noticed the cuff of his dark glove shifted just enough to reveal a faint scrape across the side of his wrist. It had looked fresh, almost the same age as the wolf's injury. Emily immediately shook her head at the absurd thought forming in her imagination. There were countless ways someone could receive a small scrape. The similarity meant nothing. Still, curiosity quietly settled beside reason, refusing to leave. The opportunity to test her growing suspicion arrived the very next morning. Emily stopped at the small craft store before work and purchased a narrow spool of deep blue satin ribbon. It was no wider than her little finger, soft enough not to irritate an animal and bright enough to notice from a distance. She tucked it into her apron pocket without quite knowing whether she intended to use it. Late that afternoon, after leaving the bakery, she found the wolf waiting beneath the old oak tree near Miller Creek. The great animal stood as calmly as ever, watching her approach with patient silver eyes. Emily smiled. "I have something for you, but only if you promise not to think it is silly." The wolf remained perfectly still. She slowly removed the ribbon and held it where the wolf could see it. "Just for today," she whispered. "Then I will take it off tomorrow." With remarkable trust, the giant wolf lowered its head. Emily carefully tied the ribbon into a loose knot around the thick fur just below its neck, adjusting it until the bright blue fabric rested comfortably without tightening. She stepped back and laughed. "There. Now you look slightly less mysterious." The wolf blinked once, then gently nudged her shoulder with its nose before settling beside her on the grass. For nearly an hour they remained by the creek while amber leaves drifted across the quiet water. As sunset painted the sky with warm shades of orange and rose, the wolf suddenly lifted its head toward the forest. Its ears turned toward a distant sound Emily could not hear. Without hesitation it rose, looked at her one last time, and disappeared silently among the pines, the blue ribbon still visible against its dark fur until the trees swallowed it completely. Emily returned home, smiling at the simple memory. The next morning Frost Hollow awoke to crisp air and bright sunshine. Shortly after breakfast, word spread that the Alpha King would address several town officials regarding land records and conservation agreements. Curious residents quietly gathered outside Town Hall. Emily arrived carrying fresh bread for the meeting. As she stepped inside, the Alpha King turned to greet her. Everything about him appeared exactly as before. The charcoal coat, the calm gray eyes, the composed expression. Then Emily noticed something that caused her heart to skip. Fastened neatly beneath the collar of his overcoat, almost hidden against the dark fabric, was a narrow strip of deep blue satin ribbon. Emily Carter stood perfectly still, her eyes fixed on the narrow strip of deep blue ribbon fastened beneath the Alpha King's collar. It was the same ribbon she had tied around the giant wolf's neck only the evening before. Not a similar ribbon, not the same shade. The very same ribbon, complete with the tiny, uneven knot she had laughed about after struggling to make it sit straight against the thick black fur. Her first thought was that someone had played an elaborate joke. Her second thought disappeared the moment the Alpha King quietly reached up, untied the ribbon with careful fingers, and held it out toward her. "I believe this belongs to you," he said calmly. Emily accepted it without speaking. Her heart beat so loudly she barely noticed the officials continuing their meeting across the room. She searched his face for an explanation, but his expression revealed almost nothing beyond quiet patience. "Where did you get this?" she finally whispered. Instead of answering immediately, he glanced through the large window overlooking the forest beyond Frost Hollow. Sunlight spilled across the distant pine trees, turning the autumn leaves into waves of gold. "Come with me," he said. Emily hesitated only a moment before following him outside. They walked beyond the town square, past Miller Creek, and along the familiar gravel path leading toward the edge of the forest where the giant wolf had first begun following her weeks ago. Neither of them spoke. The silence felt strangely comfortable, interrupted only by the rustling leaves beneath their footsteps and the distant songs of birds preparing for evening. At last the Alpha King stopped in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines. Emily recognized it immediately. It was the same place where she had cleaned the wolf's injured paw after the rainstorm. "You have been asking yourself many questions," he said quietly. "Today you deserve honest answers." Emily tightened her fingers around the ribbon. "Does this have something to do with the wolf?" He looked directly into her eyes. "Everything has something to do with the wolf." A gentle breeze drifted through the clearing. Emily noticed the unusual stillness of the forest. Even the squirrels had gone quiet, as though the woods themselves were waiting. The Alpha King slowly removed his gloves and placed them on a nearby fallen log. "What I am about to show you has remained hidden from almost everyone for many years," he said. "Not because I wish to deceive you, but because revealing it too soon would have placed greater burdens on your life." Emily opened her mouth to respond, but the words never came. The air around them seemed to shimmer with a soft silver glow that reflected through the trees like moonlight appearing before sunset. The Alpha King closed his eyes for only a brief moment. There was no frightening sound, no explosion of light, no sudden chaos. Instead, the silver glow gently surrounded him like mist rising from the earth after rain. Emily watched in silent disbelief as his familiar outline gradually changed. His broad shoulders lowered. Dark fabric disappeared beneath flowing midnight fur. Powerful arms became strong front legs. Within moments, standing in the clearing where the Alpha King had been only seconds before, was the enormous black wolf she had come to know so well. The same silver eyes looked back at her with unmistakable warmth. The same faint scar rested near one shoulder. The same calm patience filled every quiet breath. Emily felt her knees weaken, not from fear, but from the overwhelming realization that every impossible coincidence suddenly made perfect sense. The wolf stepped forward slowly until only a few feet separated them. Around its neck there was no ribbon now, only the place where it had rested the previous evening. Emily looked down at the blue satin still clutched in her hands before lifting her eyes once more to meet those familiar silver eyes. "It was you," she whispered. The wolf gently lowered its head. Images rushed through her mind one after another. The injured paw she had treated. The scrape she later noticed on the Alpha King's wrist. Every time the wolf disappeared just before the Alpha King arrived. Every calm conversation. Every unreadable smile. Every strange moment when she had unknowingly compared them to each other while speaking to the very same person. A soft laugh escaped her despite the tears gathering in her eyes. "I told you that you seemed friendlier than the Alpha King." The great wolf blinked once. The silver light quietly returned, wrapping around the massive form with the same peaceful grace as before. Moments later, the Alpha King stood before her once again, his expression no longer guarded by distant formality. For the first time since she had met him, Emily saw something entirely different in his eyes. Relief. "I wanted to tell you many times," he admitted softly, "but I needed you to know me before you knew my title." Emily looked at him for a long moment before smiling through her astonishment. "I suppose I did." The Alpha King returned the smallest genuine smile she had ever seen from him. "You trusted the wolf long before you trusted the king." Emily glanced down at the blue ribbon resting in her hand, then carefully stepped forward and tied it once again beneath the collar of his dark coat. "Then perhaps," she said gently, "I have trusted the same person all along." For a long time neither of them spoke. The forest that had once seemed mysterious now felt strangely familiar, as though every quiet path and towering pine had been patiently waiting for this single moment. Emily Carter looked at the Alpha King with new eyes, yet she found herself smiling because, despite the impossible truth she had just witnessed, he somehow still felt exactly the same. He was still the silent guardian who had waited outside her cottage through cold nights. He was still the patient companion who had accepted homemade bread, trusted her healing hands, and followed several respectful steps behind without asking for anything in return. Only now she understood why his calm gray eyes had always reminded her of another pair she already knew by heart. "Does anyone else know?" she asked softly. The Alpha King shook his head. "Only a handful of people within my council. The people of Frost Hollow know me as their visitor. They know the wolf only as a mystery." Emily lowered her eyes toward the blue ribbon resting beneath his collar. "Then why tell me?" His answer came without hesitation. "Because I never wanted our friendship to become another secret." The honesty in his voice touched something deep inside her. She had spent much of her life believing that important people rarely spoke plainly. Yet standing before her was the most powerful man she had ever met, choosing honesty over convenience. They slowly began walking back toward town together. As they reached the edge of Miller Creek, the Alpha King paused beside an old wooden bench weathered by countless seasons. "There is something else you deserve to know," he said. Emily turned toward him. "When I first came to Frost Hollow, it was not by chance." She listened quietly. "Many years ago, before you were old enough to remember, your father helped someone who could never publicly repay him." Emily frowned in surprise. "My father?" She remembered him only through faded photographs and a few treasured stories told by elderly neighbors after he had passed away while she was still very young. "He was known for helping anyone who needed it," she said. The Alpha King nodded. "One winter night, during a heavy snowstorm, he found an injured black wolf trapped beneath fallen branches in these woods." Emily's eyes widened. That was you. Yes. His calm voice carried quiet gratitude rather than pride. He did not know who I truly was. He saw only a wounded creature that needed help. He carried food into the forest for nearly a week until I recovered enough to leave on my own. Emily looked toward the surrounding trees as memories she had never understood suddenly returned. As a little girl, she had once asked her father why he always left extra food near the forest during winter. He had simply smiled and said, "Kindness should never depend on names." She had thought he was talking about stray animals. Tears gently filled her eyes. He never told anyone. He asked for nothing in return. The Alpha King replied. That kind of compassion is rare. Emily swallowed the emotion rising in her throat. So you came back because of him. I came back to honor a promise. The breeze carried the scent of pine across the creek as he continued. Before I left those woods, I vowed that if his family ever needed protection, I would stand watch myself. Emily looked at him in astonishment. You have been keeping that promise all these years. Whenever circumstances allowed. A quiet smile crossed his face. Recently, there were signs that someone had taken an unhealthy interest in the ancient forests surrounding Frost Hollow. I decided it was finally time to remain close instead of watching from a distance. Emily suddenly understood why the wolf had appeared weeks before the Alpha King's official visit. He had not arrived because of politics or ceremonies. He had arrived because of a promise made to one kind man long ago. They resumed walking until the first houses of Frost Hollow came into view. Evening lights glowed warmly behind familiar windows. People greeted Emily with cheerful waves, completely unaware that the quiet gentleman beside her was also the giant wolf they had whispered about for weeks. As they entered town, Sheriff Collins approached with a respectful nod. Your Majesty, he said, the council meeting is ready whenever you are. The Alpha King acknowledged him before looking back at Emily. Will you be all right? She smiled gently. I think I finally understand why I never felt afraid. He studied her expression for a moment before returning the warmest smile she had yet seen from him. Then perhaps my disguise worked better than I expected. Emily laughed softly. Not entirely. I always knew there was something unusually kind about that wolf. The Alpha King inclined his head with quiet amusement before following Sheriff Collins toward Town Hall. Emily remained where she was, watching him disappear into the evening crowd. Moments later, she noticed something familiar at the edge of the square. Large, fresh paw prints crossed the damp grass beside the courthouse, leading toward the forest before fading beneath fallen leaves. She smiled to herself. Whether he walked on 2 feet or 4, one truth had never changed. From the very beginning, the Alpha King had never stopped keeping his promise. The weeks that followed brought an unfamiliar peace to Frost Hollow. The excitement surrounding the Alpha King's visit slowly settled into ordinary life, yet something gentle had changed throughout the town. Children no longer whispered frightened stories about the giant black wolf because no one had seen the mysterious guardian since the Alpha King's arrival. Emily Carter smiled quietly whenever she overheard those conversations, carrying the truth like a precious secret she had no desire to share. Each morning she still opened the bakery before sunrise, greeted familiar neighbors by name, and delivered warm bread to the elderly residents who depended on her kindness. From the outside, her life looked exactly the same. Only she knew that every evening, after the streets had grown quiet and the last porch lights began glowing beneath the autumn sky, someone was always waiting near the edge of the forest. Sometimes he came as the Alpha King, dressed in the same dark coat with the blue ribbon still fastened beneath the collar. Other nights, when the moon rose high above the pines, a giant black wolf quietly emerged from the trees and walked beside her along the peaceful trails surrounding Miller Creek. Emily no longer wondered which form was more genuine. Both belonged to the same gentle soul she had trusted from the beginning. One crisp Saturday morning, the Alpha King invited the entire town to gather near the old community park where generations of families had celebrated festivals beneath enormous maple trees. People expected an official announcement about land agreements or conservation plans. Instead, they found tables covered with maps, photographs, and drawings showing new walking trails, protected forests, and restored wildlife habitats that would preserve the valley for future generations. The Alpha King addressed the crowd with the same calm confidence Emily had come to admire. He spoke not about power or authority, but about responsibility, reminding everyone that true strength was measured by the lives people chose to protect rather than the influence they possessed. As the meeting ended, Sheriff Collins stepped forward with a thoughtful smile. "There is one more thing the town wishes to do today." Emily looked around in confusion as several neighbors approached carrying a handcrafted wooden sign carved from polished oak. Across its smooth surface were simple words burned carefully into the wood. "Carter Woodland Preserve." Emily's eyes widened. Mrs. Dalton gently squeezed her hand. "Your father spent years protecting these woods when very few people cared what happened to them," the elderly woman said. "We think it is time everyone remembered." Emily could barely find her voice. Before she could answer, the Alpha King quietly joined them. "The preserve will remain protected for generations," he said. "It is a promise." Emily looked from the wooden sign to the surrounding forest where golden leaves drifted peacefully through the afternoon sunlight. For the first time, she realized that her father's quiet kindness had never disappeared. It had continued through every life his compassion had touched, reaching farther than he could ever have imagined. As evening settled across Frost Hollow, the celebration gradually came to an end. Families returned home carrying leftover pie and fresh bread, while laughter echoed through the cooling air. Emily remained behind for a few moments beside the entrance to the newly dedicated preserve. The Alpha King approached quietly until they stood together beneath the same towering oak where the giant wolf had once waited for her so many evenings before. "Your father would be proud of you," he said softly. Emily smiled. "I hope he would be proud of both of us." A comfortable silence settled between them before she looked toward the forest. "Will you still follow me everywhere?" she asked with gentle amusement. The Alpha King's gray eyes warmed with unmistakable affection. "Only if you continue pretending not to notice." Emily laughed, the sound carrying lightly through the quiet trees. As twilight deepened, silver moonlight filtered through the branches overhead. The Alpha King stepped back toward the forest, and moments later the familiar giant black wolf emerged from the gathering shadows, with calm silver eyes and midnight fur glowing beneath the rising moon. Emily reached out to stroke the soft fur behind one ear exactly as she had on that rainy evening long ago. The wolf leaned gently into her hand before turning toward the winding trail. Together they walked beneath the whispering pines, neither leading nor following for a while, simply sharing the peaceful path until the trees opened onto a hill overlooking the lights of Frost Hollow below. From that quiet place, Emily understood something she would carry for the rest of her life. Titles could command respect. Power could inspire fear. But neither had been the reason she trusted him. She had trusted the silent guardian who waited outside her home through lonely nights, accepted kindness without asking for recognition, and honored a promise made to one good man across many passing years. Long after stories faded into legend, the people of Frost Hollow would still speak about the mysterious black wolf who had once watched over their little town. They would never know that the greatest king among them had chosen to be remembered not for his crown, but for the quiet footsteps that always remained a few gentle paces behind the woman he had promised to protect.